Sarah Chen pressed her face against the observation window of Food Court 7, watching supply ships drift into Space Station Harmony's docking bays. The massive station hung at the edge of human space like a shining silver starfish, its 5 massive arms reaching out to welcome vessels from across the galaxy. Today, though, the usual stream of merchant ships had slowed to a trickle. "Another luxury cruiser," she muttered, counting the 3rd pleasure yacht she'd seen that morning. The real supply ships, the ones carrying food and essentials, were conspicuously absent. The shortage was entering its 3rd week, and even 13-year-old Sarah could feel the tension building throughout the station. Her mother's voice crackled through her comm implant. "Sarah, honey, remember to eat your lunch before your afternoon classes. Real food only. No synthesized snacks." "Yes, Mom," Sarah replied, patting the insulated container in her bag. Inside was one of the last real meals they had stockpiled. Her mother's homemade dumplings, carefully rationed from their personal garden supplies. The scarcity made each bite precious. The food court's usual bustle had diminished to scattered gatherings of station residents and visitors, all of them casting worried glances at the automated kiosks displaying limited menu options available in a dozen languages. Sarah was about to head to her usual corner when the station's artificial gravity shifted slightly, a telltale sign of a large ship docking. Through the window, she saw it, a massive vessel unlike anything she'd seen before. Its hull was covered in what looked like overlapping scales of dark metal, and its shape reminded her of the manta rays she'd seen in the station's aquarium. As she watched, smaller ships began emerging from its sides like pilotfish. Within minutes they arrived, the Cracks. Sarah had only seen them in news feeds before. Towering reptiloid beings with iridescent scales and eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. But these Cracks looked different from the diplomats and traders she'd seen in videos. Their scales were dulled, their movements heavy with fatigue, and their military uniforms showed signs of wear. The food court fell silent as 6 Cracks officers entered, their heavy footsteps echoing across the metal floor. They approached the kiosks, speaking in their clicking language, only to be met with the same limited options messages that had frustrated everyone else. Sarah watched as they huddled together, checking what looked like credit chips and speaking in increasingly agitated tones. One of them, the smallest, though still over 7 feet tall, slumped against a wall, their scales taking on a pale, sickly hue. Before she could second-guess herself, Sarah was moving. Her mother's warnings about being careful with their food rations echoed in her head, but something else her mom always said rang louder. In times of crisis, kindness is not a luxury. It's a necessity. She approached the group, her heart hammering but her steps steady. The Cracks turned to look at her, their vertical pupils widening slightly. Sarah pulled out her lunch container and held it up. "Excuse me," she said clearly, knowing their translation devices would pick up her words. "Would you like to share my lunch? It's not much, but it's real food. My mom's dumplings from our garden." The Cracks stared at her in silence. The one who had slumped against the wall straightened, their scales shifting color slightly. The tallest one, clearly their leader, knelt down to Sarah's level, bringing their face close to hers. She could see the intricate patterns in their scales, like living circuitry. "Young human," they said, their translator rendering their clicks into softly accented English. "Do you understand who we are?" Sarah nodded. "You're Cracks military, right? And you look hungry. My mom says nobody should have to go hungry, no matter where they're from." The leader's scales rippled with what Sarah hoped was amusement rather than offense. "Your mother is wise," they said. "But why would you share your food with soldiers from a species not your own?" Sarah shrugged, opening the container. The aroma of the dumplings filled the air, and she saw several of the Cracks' sensory crests rise in interest. "Because you need it, and because maybe if we share food instead of fighting over it, there wouldn't be shortages in the first place." The leader was silent for a long moment, their ancient eyes studying her face. Finally, they'd reached out with scaled hands and accepted the container with a formal bow. "I am Squadron Commander Vextal," they said. "And you have given us more than food, young human. You have given us something to think about." As the cracks carefully shared the dumplings among themselves, making appreciative clicks and trills, Sarah noticed something strange. Other station residents were approaching, opening their own lunch containers, offering what they could spare. The silence of fear had transformed into a quiet murmur of conversation as humans and aliens alike began to share what little they had. What Sarah couldn't know, was that her simple act of sharing lunch was about to ripple across the galaxy in ways no one could have predicted. Because Squadron Commander Vextal wasn't just any Cracks officer, and their massive ship hadn't come to Space Station Harmony by chance. They were the advanced scout of something much bigger, and Sarah's dumplings had just changed their entire mission. But that would all become clear soon enough. For now, Sarah just smiled as she watched the Cracks carefully wrapping a dumpling in a napkin, explaining that they wished to preserve it to show their high command what they had discovered about humans today. The food shortage on Space Station Harmony would continue for another week, but something else had begun that day in Food Court 7, something that would reshape the relationship between humans and Cracks forever. And it all started with a 13-year-old girl who decided that kindness wasn't a luxury, but a necessity. Sarah didn't expect to be summoned to Station Commander Wilson's office the next morning. She certainly didn't expect to find her mother already there, along with Squadron Commander Vextal and 2 other Cracks officers in full ceremonial armor. "Please, sit down, Miss Chen," Commander Wilson said, his weathered face unreadable. Sarah perched on the edge of a chair designed for humans, while her mother squeezed her hand reassuringly. Through the office's viewport, Sarah could see the Cracks vessel still docked, its scaled hull catching starlight. But it wasn't alone anymore. 3 more ships had arrived overnight, their designs completely different, sleek, almost organic-looking vessels that seemed to pulse with internal light. "The Meriton Alliance," Vextal explained, following her gaze. Their scales had taken on a deeper, more vibrant hue since yesterday. "They tracked our fleet here. We suspected they might." Commander Wilson leaned forward. "Sarah, what you did yesterday, it's had some unexpected consequences. The recording of your interaction with the Cracks has gone viral across both civilizations' networks." Sarah blinked. "Recording? But I just shared my lunch." "Precisely," one of the other Cracks officers said. Sarah recognized them from yesterday. "You shared food with soldiers you had been taught to fear. Do you know how long our peoples have been at war with the Meriton?" Sarah shook her head. 372 of your Earth years," Vextal said quietly, "over a misunderstanding about shared resources that grew into a blood feud. Both sides forgot how to see the other as people. Until yesterday." The office door chimed, and 2 new figures entered. Sarah had to stop herself from gasping. The Meriton were beautiful in an alien way. Their bodies seemed to be made of crystalline structures that shifted and flowed like liquid glass, catching and refracting light in rainbow patterns. "This is First Speaker Lumina of the Meriton Alliance," Commander Wilson introduced. "They've come to, well, perhaps they should explain." The Meriton leader's voice was like wind chimes. "We watched the recording, young Sarah Chen. We saw Cracks warriors, our ancient enemies, sharing food with a human child. More importantly, we saw how they looked at you. With respect. With hope." Sarah's mother spoke up for the first time. "I don't understand. Why is this so important?" Vextal's scales rippled. "Because, Dr. Chen, your daughter did something neither of our species has managed in centuries. She saw past our differences. The recording shows her approaching us without fear, offering food not because we demanded it, but because she saw we were hungry. It has caused considerable discussion among both our peoples. Riots, actually," Commander Wilson corrected, "on both sides. Some calling for immediate peace talks, others calling it a human trick." First Speaker Lumina finished. "A plot to destabilize both our civilizations. That's why we're here, Sarah Chen. We need your help." Sarah looked between the aliens and the station commander. My help. But I'm just a kid. Exactly, Vextel said. That's precisely why it must be you. Both our peoples trust children to speak truth without agenda. We would like you to address both our civilizations, to explain why you did what you did. But I told you yesterday, Sarah said. You were hungry. Mom always says, kindness is not a luxury, it's a necessity, her mother finished, then looked alarmed. Wait, you want my 13-year-old daughter to address two warring civilizations? First speaker Lumina's crystalline form shifted. We need her to remind our peoples of something they've forgotten. That sometimes the simplest acts carry the most wisdom. Commander Wilson cleared his throat. Of course, this is entirely voluntary. And if you agree, Sarah, we'll ensure your safety. But you should know, the supply shortage that brought the cracks here. It's affecting half the galaxy. The war between the cracks and Meriton has disrupted trade routes, caused refugees to flood stable systems. What started as a simple lunch could be the key to ending centuries of conflict. Sarah felt the weight of their stares, human, cracks, and Meriton. She thought about the hungry crack soldiers, about how sharing food had made them seem less alien, more like people far from home. She thought about her mother's words about kindness. Okay, she said finally. I'll do it, but I have one condition. The adults all leaned forward expectantly. If I'm going to talk to everyone. Sarah said, I want to do it over dinner. With food from all our worlds, because maybe if we eat together, we can remember we're not so different after all. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Vextel's scales flushed with color as they laughed, a sound like chiming bells. Do you see? They said to the others. This is why it must be her. First speaker Lumina's crystalline form sparkled. Agreed. A meal shared between enemies becomes a feast between friends. As the adults began discussing logistics, Sarah gazed out at the ships gathered around Space Station Harmony. Yesterday, she'd just been trying to help some hungry soldiers. Now she was somehow planning a dinner party that might change the galaxy. Her mother squeezed her hand again. Are you sure about this, honey? Sarah nodded. Someone has to take the first step, right? And anyway, she grinned. I really want to know what Meriton food tastes like. But as she watched more ships appearing in the distance, media vessels from a dozen worlds, diplomatic shuttles, even more military craft, Sarah wondered if perhaps she'd bitten off more than she could chew. The price of kindness, it seemed, was responsibility. She just hoped she was ready for it. 2 days later, Food Court 7 had been transformed. Gone were the limited menu signs, replaced by an array of dishes from 3 civilizations that stretched along tables arranged in a triangle. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. 3 peoples, meeting as equals. Sarah stood at her designated spot, trying not to fidget in her new formal outfit. The station's fabricators had worked overtime to create appropriate ceremonial wear for her. A midnight blue dress embedded with tiny lights that mimicked the star patterns visible from Space Station Harmony. Her mother had said it made her look like she was wearing the galaxy itself. Remember, Commander Wilson said quietly beside her, just be yourself. That's what got us here in the first place. The space station's communications array was patched directly into the broadcast networks of both the Cracks and Meriton civilizations, as well as human space. Billions would be watching. Sarah tried not to think about that part. The Cracks delegation entered first, led by Squadron Commander Vextel. But they weren't alone. Behind them came the Cracks High Command, 12 ancient warriors whose scales bore the patterns of hundreds of battles. Their presence made it clear this wasn't just a publicity stunt. The Meriton arrived moments later, first speaker Lumina leading a procession of crystalline beings whose forms flowed like liquid starlight. Among them was their Council of Harmonics, their highest governing body. The air seemed to sing with their presence. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward. The words she prepared seemed to evaporate from her mind, so she decided to speak from her heart instead. Welcome to Food Court 7, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the translator systems. 2 days ago, I shared my lunch here because I saw people who were hungry. Today, we're sharing much more than food. We're sharing a chance to see each other as people, not enemies. She gestured to the tables. Every dish here tells a story. The dumplings that started this. They're from my mom's garden. The cracks brought jera fruit, which I learned is traditionally shared between warriors before battle to honor each other's strength. And the meriton. She smiled at their shimmering forms. They'd brought crystallized starlight itself, which they only create to celebrate new life. The high command of both species shifted, surprised that this human child had learned these details about their cultures. But the most important dish here, Sarah continued, is one we created together. She pointed to the center of the triangle of tables, where a single platter sat. Station hydroponics provided the base ingredients. Cracked spices gave it strength. Meriton crystal light gave it beauty, and human hands helped bring it all together. It's something new, just like what we could be together. First speaker Lumina moved forward, their crystalline form catching the light. You speak wisdom beyond your years, Sarah Chen. But tell us, why should centuries of conflict end because of one child's kindness? Sarah met their prismatic gaze steadily. Because that's not why it's ending. It's ending because that kindness reminded everyone what we've forgotten. That before we were enemies, we were just people who could have been friends. The recording didn't go viral because I shared food. It went viral because everyone who watched it remembered who they used to be, before the war made them forget. A murmur ran through both delegations. On screen displays around the food court, Sarah could see reactions pouring in from across the galaxy. Beams of all species watching, listening, hoping. My mom's a biologist, Sarah continued. She studies how small changes can affect entire ecosystems. She says sometimes the smallest organism can change everything. Maybe kindness works the same way. Maybe we just needed one small moment to remember that we can choose to be different. Vextal stepped forward, their scales gleaming. The young human speaks truth. Our war began over resources, yet we have spent more destroying each other than we ever fought over. Perhaps it is time to feast rather than fight. First speaker Luminous form sparkled in agreement. The harmonics have consulted. We too are hungry for change. Sarah smiled and picked up 3 plates. She served a portion of the new collaborative dish onto each one. Then let's eat together. Because a meal shared between former enemies becomes a feast between friends. Both alien leaders finished, accepting their plates. As the delegations began to mingle, trying each other's foods and cautiously beginning conversations, Sarah felt her mother's hand on her shoulder. "I'm so proud of you," Dr. Chen whispered. Sarah watched as a young Krax warrior shared jera fruit with a Meriton harmonist, their ancient species barriers melting away over simple food. "I just hope it lasts," she said. Commander Wilson joined them, his face showing careful optimism. It will take more than one dinner to end centuries of war, but sometimes all we need is a reminder of our common ground, or in this case, our common hunger. What none of them could know was that across the galaxy, others were watching and learning. In countless homes, schools, and gathering places, beings of different species were reaching out to each other, sharing meals, starting conversations. The ripples of Sarah's simple act were spreading farther than anyone could have imagined. And in Food Court 7, where it all began, a human girl watched as ancient enemies became new friends over dinner, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could indeed change the galaxy. 1 month after the historic dinner in Food Court 7, Sarah sat in a newly constructed chamber aboard Space Station Harmony. The circular room had been designed specifically for what the media was calling the Harmony Talks, with 3 distinct sections that accommodated the physical needs of each species while positioning everyone as equals. The chamber's center featured a holographic projection of the collaborative dish from the dinner, now known across the galaxy as peace pudding, much to Sarah's embarrassment. But its symbolic power was undeniable. Thousands of restaurants across all 3 civilizations had added their own versions to their menus. The preliminary terms are prepared, Commander Wilson announced, his formal uniform gleaming under the chamber's lights. But before we proceed, the delegations have requested that Sarah Chen review them first. Sarah straightened in her chair, surprised. Me? But I'm not a diplomat. That first speaker Lumina chimed, their crystalline form refracting rainbow patterns across the chamber, is precisely why we want your opinion. You see with unclouded eyes. Squadron Commander Vextal, now appointed as the Krax's chief negotiator, nodded in agreement. Their scales had taken on a deep, peaceful blue that Sarah had learned indicated contentment. Your wisdom comes from simplicity, young one. We would hear your thoughts. The terms appeared in holographic form before her, translated into all 3 languages. As Sarah read, she felt a growing sense of both pride and concern. The agreements were comprehensive. Trade routes, resource sharing, cultural exchange programs. But something felt missing. It's good, she said slowly, but it's all about big things. Ships and trades and borders. What about the small things? Explain, the Meriton Council of Harmonics requested in unison. Sarah stood up and walked to the hologram of the peace pudding. This worked because it was personal. We didn't just share resources, we shared stories, traditions, memories. But these terms, they're just about stuff. She turned to face the gathered delegates. What if every diplomatic meeting had to start with a meal together? What if before anyone could negotiate anything, they had to share something personal from their culture? What if we made it impossible to see each other as just enemies? The chamber fell silent as her words sank in. Then, remarkably, the Krax High Command began to laugh. A sound that had once struck fear across the galaxy now filled the chamber with warmth. From the mouths of children, one ancient warrior said, their scales shimmering with mirth, we have spent decades crafting political solutions, when what we needed was a reminder of our shared humanity, if you'll pardon the term. First speaker Lumina's form pulsed with agreement. The child speaks wisdom again. Formal protocols without personal connection are like our crystalline forms without light, structured but lifeless. Commander Wilson was already making notes. We could call it the Harmony Protocol. Required personal and cultural exchange before any formal diplomatic engagement. More than that, Vextal added, their scales rippling with excitement. The human concept of breaking bread together should be central to all diplomatic functions. No decisions made without first sharing a meal. The chamber erupted in discussion as diplomats from all 3 species began building on the idea. Sarah watched in amazement as her simple suggestion transformed into a formal diplomatic doctrine. They were literally rewriting the rules of galactic diplomacy based on sharing lunch. Dr. Chen, who had been quietly observing from her designated seat, came to stand beside her daughter. You've started quite the revolution, honey. Sarah shook her head. I just said what made sense. I mean, it's harder to hate someone after you've shared their favorite food, right? Indeed, a voice chimed behind them. A young Meriton harmonist approached, their form shifting nervously. Which is why I hoped. That is, if it's not inappropriate. Might I share with you a personal creation? The harmonist's form rippled, and suddenly they were holding what looked like crystallized music, notes frozen in translucent beauty. It's a harmony I composed, inspired by the sounds of human laughter and cracked scale songs. I thought perhaps, for the first official implementation of the Harmony Protocol. Sarah's face lit up. It's beautiful. Can you teach me how it sounds? As the human girl and the Meriton harmonist bent over the crystallized music, other delegates drew closer, curious and eager to participate. Soon, the chamber was filled with an impromptu cultural exchange. Krax warriors demonstrating traditional dance movements, humans sharing Earth songs, Meriton creating light sculptures of their homeworlds. Commander Wilson watched it all with a slight smile. You know, he said to Dr. Chen, when I took command of this station, I never imagined our food court would become the birthplace of a new era in galactic diplomacy. Dr. Chen watched as her daughter attempted to mimic a Crack's ceremonial gesture while wearing a crown of Meriton light crystals. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. Sarah just chose kindness. But the day's biggest surprise was yet to come. As the various delegations finalized the details of the Harmony Protocol, First Speaker Lumina approached Sarah with an unprecedented proposal, one that would ensure that the legacy of that first shared lunch would echo across the stars for generations to come. 6 months after the implementation of the Harmony Protocol, Food Court 7 had become something entirely new. The simple dining area had been transformed into what was now officially known as the Galactic Harmony Center, though most people still called it Sarah's Table. Sarah stood at its entrance, still amazed by how everything had changed. The space had been expanded to include 3 distinct environmental zones, allowing beings from any of the allied species to dine in comfort. The center table, her table, remained exactly where she'd first shared her lunch with the Crack soldiers, now marked with a simple plaque. Here, a child's kindness changed the galaxy, one meal at a time. "Ready for your first official day?" Commander Wilson asked, approaching with her mother. Sarah smoothed down her new uniform, a unique design that incorporated elements from all 3 civilizations. As the youngest ever appointed Harmony Protocol ambassador, she had insisted on keeping it simple. No elaborate decorations, just functional elegance with a small emblem combining human, Cracks, and Meriton symbols. "I still can't believe they created this position for me," she said. "Who better?" First Speaker Lumina chimed, their crystalline form flowing into view. "You are the living embodiment of what we seek to achieve. Besides, who else would we trust to teach the next generation?" That was the part that excited Sarah the most. Today marked the opening of the Harmony Protocol Academy, where young beings from all 3 civilizations would learn together, eat together, and grow together. The first class was arriving today, 20 students each from human space, Crack's territories, and Meriton worlds. "They're here," Vextal announced, their scales shimmering with anticipation. The young students filed in, human children trying to contain their excitement, young Cracks with scales shifting in nervous patterns, Meriton younglings whose forms sparkled with barely contained energy. They all stopped short when they saw Sarah. "Welcome to Sarah's Table," she said, smiling at their surprised faces. "I know you've all heard the story of what happened here. But today, we're going to make new stories together." She gestured to the tables, where an array of dishes from all 3 civilizations waited. First lesson of the Harmony Protocol. Before we can understand each other, we have to share with each other. So today, we're having lunch. As the young beings cautiously began to mingle, Sarah moved among them, encouraging interactions, explaining dishes, sharing stories. She watched as a young Cracks offered a piece of Jera fruit to a human girl, just as she had once offered dumplings to their soldiers. A Meriton youngling created tiny light sculptures to decorate a human boy's plate, making him laugh in delight. "You've created something remarkable here," Dr. Chen said, watching the scene with pride. "We all did," Sarah corrected. "Every person who chose to share instead of fight, to learn instead of judge. Look." She pointed to a corner where news feeds from across the galaxy played silently. They showed similar scenes playing out on hundreds of worlds, former enemies sharing meals, learning each other's customs, building bridges one meal at a time. The Harmony Protocol had spread far beyond diplomatic circles, becoming a movement that was changing society itself. "There are already applications for next year's class," Commander Wilson noted, "from 17 new species." Sarah's eyes widened. 17. First Speaker Lumina's form sparkled with amusement. Word spreads. They call it the Sarah Chen solution in some sectors, solving conflicts by starting with shared meals and personal connections before addressing political issues. The Harmony Protocol has prevented 3 potential conflicts in the past month alone, Vextal added, simply by requiring opposing parties to share a meal and cultural exchange before negotiations. Sarah watched as a young Cracks tried to teach a human boy their traditional greeting, both of them dissolving into laughter when he got it completely wrong. Nearby, a Meriton youngling was carefully creating crystal sculptures of earth animals they'd only seen in pictures, while human children clapped in delight. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah said softly. "These kids won't have to learn to see past their differences. They'll grow up knowing we're all just people who can be friends." As if to prove her point, one of the human children called out, "Ambassador Sarah, can you show us how to make peace pudding?" Soon, she was surrounded by eager young faces of all species, all wanting to learn the dish that had helped change everything. As Sarah began explaining the recipe, she caught her mother's eye and smiled. The galaxy was changing, one meal at a time. And here, at Sarah's table, the next generation was learning that peace wasn't just possible, it was delicious. Commander Wilson watched the scene with satisfaction. "You know," he said to Dr. Chen, when they first suggested making Sarah an ambassador, "I wondered if we were asking too much of a child. Now I wonder if we've all been asking too little of ourselves." Dr. Chen nodded, watching her daughter teach beings from across the galaxy how to make her dumplings. She didn't do anything complicated. She just chose to be kind when kindness seemed like a luxury. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. In the years that followed, the Harmony Protocol would become the foundation of galactic diplomacy. Space Station Harmony would expand to accommodate more species, more students, more shared meals and stories. And at the heart of it all remained Sarah's table, where a simple lunch had started it all. Because in the end, the biggest changes often start with the smallest choices, and sometimes all it takes to change the galaxy is one person choosing to share their lunch.